July 1944, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Tokyo Bay. Commander Takeshi Nakamura stood in the machine gun plant's third floor, watching engineers disassemble yet another captured American M1 Garand rifle, the seventh this month, its gas-operated mechanism laid bare on oil-stained workbenches while radio reports from Saipan crackled through speakers mounted on concrete pillars, each transmission confirming what Imperial Navy intelligence already knew. United States Marines were cutting through Japanese defensive positions with a volume of fire that defied every tactical assumption Tokyo had made about infantry combat. The commander's orders were explicit: produce a working copy within 60 days, but the tooling diagrams scattered across his desk told a different story. Japan's factories were already operating beyond capacity, raw materials dwindling, Allied bombers growing bolder, and the 8-round semi-automatic rifle in American hands was turning squad-level engagements into massacre. By August, the Type 4 rifle program would represent Japan's most desperate admission: they were fighting the wrong war with the wrong weapons against an industrial power they had catastrophically underestimated. When the first United States Army reinforcements stepped off landing craft at Lunga Point, the Marines defending Henderson Field noticed something that would alter the Pacific War's tactical reality. Nearly every soldier carried an M1 Garand rifle, its distinctive gas cylinder gleaming in equatorial sunlight, 8 rounds of .30-06 Springfield ammunition ready to fire as fast as a trained infantryman could pull the trigger, no bolt to cycle, no pause between shots, just sustained, overwhelming firepower that could turn a rifle squad into something approaching a light machine gun section. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Fry, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 57th Regiment of Philippine Scouts, had already witnessed the M1's capabilities during the desperate fighting on Bataan 9 months earlier, and his after-action report contained language rarely seen in military documents. The firepower of a battalion armed with modern weapons is something beyond description. The Garand rifle exceeds my ability to articulate its impact on combat effectiveness. The mathematics were brutal and simple. A Japanese infantry squad armed with Type 99 Arisaka rifles, bolt-action weapons requiring manual cycling after each shot, could deliver perhaps 15 aimed rounds per minute per rifleman under ideal conditions. An American squad with M1 Garands could sustain 40 to 50 rounds per minute per man, maintaining accuracy at 300 yards, creating a 3-to-1 firepower advantage before accounting for the Browning automatic rifle that anchored every United States rifle squad. Production statistics told their own story. The massive industrial complex that John C. Garand had called home since 1919 was producing at extraordinary tempo. 122,000 M1 rifles per month. That is 3,136 per day, about 164 per hour, a pace that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier when the United States was still climbing out of Depression-era economic paralysis. Shift supervisors at Springfield Armory didn't measure output in dozens or hundreds anymore. They counted in thousands, watching finished rifles roll off assembly lines in an endless procession of walnut and steel, each weapon proof-fired and function-tested before packing, each one destined for a soldier or Marine who would carry it from jungle islands to European hedgerows. The semi-automatic rifle that General George S. Patton would call the greatest battle implement ever devised. By early 1944, Winchester Repeating Arms Company had added another 13,000 rifles to the total, and the combined production exceeded 4 million M1 Garands, enough to equip every infantry division in the United States military with thousands of rifles to spare, enough to replace combat losses, enough to stockpile for future campaigns, enough to fundamentally alter how infantry engaged in ground combat. The after-action reports from Tarawa and Saipan landed on Admiral Takeo Kurita's desk like confession documents from a losing defendant. Japanese naval infantry had fought with characteristic determination, defending coral atolls and volcanic ridges until ammunition exhausted and positions became untenable, but the pattern was undeniable. United States forces were winning firefights at ranges where Japanese bolt-action rifles should have held advantage, overwhelming defensive positions with sustained fire that Japanese commanders initially attributed to machine guns, then later, grimly, to the semi-automatic rifles that seemed to arm every American infantryman. The intelligence assessment was clinical and devastating. Imperial Japanese Army ground forces, equipped primarily with Type 38 and Type 99 Arisaka rifles, were fighting a technological generation behind their primary adversary. The Type 99, chambered in 7.7 by 58 mm ammunition, was an excellent bolt-action rifle by any conventional standard, accurate, reliable, well-manufactured in the early war years, but it required a trained rifleman to manually operate the bolt after each shot, ejecting the spent cartridge, chambering a fresh round, a process that consumed precious seconds in combat, where volume of fire increasingly determined survival. Japanese military planners had known about semi-automatic rifle development since the 1930s. Tokyo Arsenal had experimented with Pedersen-type designs, Yokosuka had tested Czech ZH-29 copies, Nambu had submitted prototypes, but every program had foundered on cost, complexity, or the conservative military doctrine that viewed the bolt-action rifle as adequately modern for infantry combat against Chinese forces armed with similar weapons. The problem was simple. Japan had not anticipated fighting a protracted war against an adversary equipped with semi-automatic rifles as standard infantry weapons. The M1 Garand had entered United States service in 1936, but Japanese intelligence had dismissed it as an expensive luxury that a wealthy nation could afford for elite units, not a weapon that would arm millions of soldiers and Marines across 2 oceans. The Imperial Japanese Navy, operating with more autonomy than the Army and more willing to adopt foreign innovations, made the critical decision: copy the American M1 Garand, modify it for Japanese 7.7 mm ammunition, and produce it for naval infantry and paratroop units that would inevitably defend the home islands when the final invasion came. The program started with captured rifles. Manila had fallen to Japanese forces in early 1942, and warehouses containing United States military equipment yielded dozens of M1 Garands, weapons that had never seen combat, still packed in Cosmoline, complete with technical manuals and maintenance documentation. These rifles were carefully crated and shipped to Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, where engineers began the reverse engineering process that would consume the next 15 months. 10 rifles were immediately modified to accept 7.7 by 58 mm Arisaka ammunition. The dimensional similarities between the Japanese cartridge and the .30-06 Springfield round suggested compatibility, and initial testing proved encouraging. The M1's gas-operated mechanism could cycle Japanese ammunition. The bolt locked reliably. Accuracy remained acceptable, but a critical problem emerged. The N-block clip system that fed 8 rounds into the M1's fixed magazine was incompatible with the slightly different dimensions of Japanese cartridges. The solution required complete redesign. Japanese engineers eliminated the N-block clip entirely, instead creating a 10-round internal magazine that could be charged with 2 standard 5-round stripper clips, the same clips used for Type 99 rifles, maintaining logistical compatibility while gaining 2 additional rounds over the American original. Commander Nakamura, overseeing the development program, understood the timeline was impossible. Yokosuka was already operating at maximum capacity, producing 25 mm anti-aircraft cannons, Lewis machine guns, Vickers machine guns, all critical weapons that couldn't be delayed for an experimental rifle program. The Type 4 rifle, designated for the Japanese year 2604, corresponding to 1944, would have to be developed during spare time between primary production runs, a polite fiction that meant engineers working double shifts and machinists fabricating parts after regular production hours. By July 1944, the first functional prototype existed, a rifle that looked remarkably like the M1 Garand from 20 paces, but revealed its Japanese modifications upon closer inspection. Tangent rear sight, graduated from 100 to 1,200 meters, inverted V-shaped. Front sight with protective wings, mahogany stock, reinforced with metal tangs top and bottom, slightly shorter 23-inch barrel, and the telltale magazine protruding subtly from the stock's underline. Ford Motor Company's B-24 Liberator production facility represented American industrial capacity at its most staggering. The assembly building stretched half a mile. Employment reached 42,000 workers across 3 shifts. Production tempo, 1 4-engine heavy bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. Each B-24 contained 1,550,000 individual parts, more than 100 times the complexity of a Ford automobile, yet the production line maintained tempo that would have seemed physically impossible just 3 years earlier. This was the industrial reality confronting Japan. The United States wasn't just outproducing Japanese factories in small arms, it was outbuilding them in every category simultaneously. While Yokosuka Naval Arsenal struggled to produce 250 sets of Type 4 rifle components during spare hours between regular production, Springfield Armory was manufacturing nearly 4,000 M1 Garands per day as routine output, not maximum surge capacity, not emergency production, just normal peacetime to wartime transition manufacturing. The economic fundamentals were overwhelming. United States gross national product exceeded Japan's by a factor of 17 to 1. American steel production was 5 times larger. The United States had nearly twice Japan's population, but more critically, it had an industrial workforce that had spent the Depression years underemployed, creating enormous slack capacity that wartime mobilization could absorb without disrupting civilian economy fundamentally. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had set production goals that his own military advisors considered fantasy: 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns. Adolf Hitler, receiving intelligence reports about these targets, dismissed them as propaganda, impossible numbers designed to intimidate Axis powers rather than realistic production planning. But American industry delivered. By 1944, United States aircraft production exceeded all Japanese output from 1939 through 1945 combined, achieved in 12 months. American shipyards launched merchant tonnage faster than Japan could comprehend. The first 4 months of 1943 alone, more tonnage than Japan built in 7 years. The arsenal of democracy wasn't a slogan, it was a statistical reality that was crushing Axis industrial capacity through sheer overwhelming output. The tactical implications of the M1 Garand became undeniable during the sustained ground combat around Henderson Field, where United States Army units reinforced exhausted Marines and brought with them the latest weapons American industry could provide. Japanese forces, veterans of campaigns in China and Malaya, encountered something they had never experienced: infantry firefights where the enemy maintained continuous fire without apparent pauses for reloading. Lieutenant Colonel John B. George, serving with the 164th Infantry Regiment of the American Division, recorded detailed observations that would later form the basis of his memoir, Shots Fired in Anger. His assessment of the M1 versus the Japanese Type 99 was clinical. The Type 99 Arisaka was crude when compared to our Springfield rifle. When compared to our Garand, it was utterly obsolete, and its use against that weapon placed Japanese forces at an enormous combat disadvantage that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. The captured Japanese documents told the story from the other side. A sergeant from the 38th Division wrote in his diary, "Recovered, After the Tenaru River Battle, American soldiers fire without ceasing. We advance, and they fire 8, 10, 12 shots without pause. Our rifles require time after each shot. We cannot match their volume. Officers say fighting spirit will prevail, but bullets are faster than spirit. Imperial Japanese Army intelligence reports, compiled from prisoner interrogations and battlefield observations, struggled to explain the firepower disparity. Initial assessments attributed it to higher ammunition allocation, suggesting Americans simply carried more rounds. Later reports correctly identified the M1's semi-automatic mechanism, but underestimated its impact, treating it as marginal advantage rather than fundamental tactical revolution. Japan's war economy was collapsing under pressures that military planners had failed to anticipate. Allied submarine warfare had severed supply lines to resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia, cutting oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, bauxite for aluminum production from occupied territories. The strategic bombing campaign was intensifying, with B-29 Superfortress raids beginning to target industrial centers that had operated safely beyond range of earlier bombers. The Type 4 rifle program existed within this context of industrial desperation. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal couldn't dedicate full production capacity to rifle manufacture because anti-aircraft weapons took priority. Defending factories took precedence over equipping infantry for battles that might never occur if the home islands fell to strategic bombing first. Raw material allocation told the story. Steel production in Japan had peaked at 838,000 tons in 1943, already strained to supply shipbuilding, aircraft production, ammunition manufacture, and weapons fabrication. By 1944, bombing and blockade had reduced output, and what remained had to be allocated according to triage principles: submarines to attack American supply lines, fighters to defend industrial centers, coastal defense guns to resist invasion. A semi-automatic rifle program that might produce a few thousand weapons, even if successful, couldn't justify steel allocation that could instead produce dozens of aircraft or several hundred machine guns. The mathematics were brutal. Every ton of steel devoted to Type 4 rifles was a ton not available for weapons with clearer strategic impact. The invasion of Saipan provided the most comprehensive test of M1 Garand firepower against Japanese defensive positions. United States Marines and Army units, now universally equipped with the semi-automatic rifle, faced Japanese forces dug into prepared positions across volcanic terrain that heavily favored defenders. The firepower differential was devastating. American rifle squads could suppress Japanese positions with sustained fire while maneuvering, something bolt-action rifles made tactically difficult. The M1's 8-round capacity meant riflemen could engage multiple targets without reloading, critical in the rapid target acquisition scenarios that characterized Pacific Island combat. On July 7, 1944, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito ordered the largest banzai attack of the Pacific War, throwing more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers against United States Army positions held by the 27th Infantry Division. The attack dissolved into slaughter. American M1 rifles, firing as quickly as trained soldiers could acquire targets and pull triggers, created a wall of .30-06 ammunition that no amount of courage could penetrate. Captain Benjamin L. Salomon, a dentist serving as battalion surgeon, found himself defending an aid station when Japanese forces overran the perimeter. Armed with an M1 Garand taken from a wounded soldier, then later an M1917 machine gun, Salomon killed 98 attacking Japanese soldiers before being overwhelmed. His Medal of Honor citation, delayed for decades due to Geneva Convention complications, represented the ultimate testimony to American infantry firepower. One man, with American weapons, could hold against a company-strength attack. By late summer 1944, the Type 4 rifle program had reached its maximum output. approximately 250 complete parts sets produced. Of those, only 125 were actually assembled into functional rifles. The remainder sat in storage, lacking wooden stocks because forestry supplies had been redirected to aircraft production, the camphor wood needed for propeller manufacture taking priority over rifle stocks. The assembled rifles revealed quality issues that would have required months of refinement under normal circumstances. Feed mechanisms jammed intermittently. The 10-round magazine's follower spring tension wasn't properly calibrated. The gas system occasionally failed to provide sufficient pressure for reliable cycling, problems that American Springfield Armory had solved during the M1's development in the 1930s, but that Yokosuka engineers, working under impossible time constraints with inadequate resources, couldn't resolve. 20 Type 4 rifles were delivered to the Naval Paratrooper Command for field testing, but no combat reports exist. The weapons likely remained in armories, awaiting the invasion that would justify their deployment, but by this point, Japan's strategic situation made rifle selection almost irrelevant. American control of the air meant Japanese ground forces faced naval bombardment and close air support that no infantry weapon could counter. The tactical advantages of semi-automatic rifles mattered in infantry versus infantry engagements, but those engagements were becoming rarer as American combined arms tactics overwhelmed Japanese defensive positions with coordinated firepower from multiple domains. The numbers told a story of industrial mismatch so complete it approached absurdity. Springfield Armory, January 1944, 122,000 M1 rifles per month. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, entire 1944-1945 period, 125 Type 4 rifles assembled total. Springfield Armory was producing per day what Yokosuka couldn't manufacture in 15 months of concentrated effort. The United States was equipping entire divisions with M1 Garands faster than Japan could produce enough Type 4 rifles to arm a single company. The industrial capacity gap extended beyond rifles. United States factories produced 5,468,172 M1 Garands during the rifle's entire production run from 1936 through the Korean War. Japan, attempting to copy this single weapon, managed 250 partial sets before resources, time, and industrial capacity exhausted completely. The strategic bombing campaign that would culminate in the firebombing of Tokyo was already disrupting Japanese industrial production months before the massive incendiary raids began. B-29 Super Fortress bombers, operating from bases in China and later the Marianas, targeted aircraft factories, steel mills, oil refineries, the infrastructure that supported military production. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, despite its naval designation and proximity to Tokyo Bay, wasn't immune to disruption. Air raid alerts forced production halts, workers diverted to firefighting and damage control, power interruptions when electrical grids were hit, transportation bottlenecks when rail lines were damaged. The Type 4 program, already relegated to spare-time production, lost even that limited capacity as the arsenal focused on immediate survival and weapons with clearer military utility. By autumn 1944, the decision was effectively made. The Type 4 rifle would not enter mass production. Resources didn't exist, time had run out, and Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where infantry rifles, regardless of capability, couldn't alter the war's trajectory. The program continued nominally, parts remained in storage, assembled rifles sat in armories, but everyone involved understood the industrial and military reality. When Emperor Hirohito's radio address announced Japan's surrender, Commander Nakamura stood in the same third-floor workshop where the Type 4 program had begun 14 months earlier. The captured American M1 Garands still sat on workbenches, disassembled for study that would never be completed. Partially assembled Type 4 rifles lined racks along the wall, weapons that would never see combat, solutions to problems that industrial reality had made unsolvable. Allied occupation forces arrived at Yokosuka within days, cataloging Japanese military equipment with bureaucratic efficiency. The Type 4 rifles drew immediate interest, American ordnance officers recognizing their own M1 Garand's design principles in the Japanese copy, noting modifications and changes that revealed both Japanese engineering skill and the desperate circumstances under which the weapons were produced. 20 Type 4 rifles were selected for shipment to the United States, destined for Aberdeen Proving Ground and other testing facilities where American engineers would evaluate Japanese attempts to copy their semi-automatic rifle. The remainder were destroyed, along with most Japanese military equipment, ground under occupation forces' directive to demilitarize the defeated empire. The official report, compiled by United States Army Ordnance, was clinically precise. Japanese Type 4 rifle represents competent reverse engineering of the M1 Garand design, with modifications appropriate to available manufacturing capacity and ammunition standardization requirements. Quality of construction varies significantly between specimens, suggesting production under resource constraints. Total production estimated at 250 units maximum, none confirmed to have seen combat deployment. Military historians and industrial analysts examining the Pacific War's material dimensions identified the Type 4 rifle program as a microcosm of Japan's fundamental strategic error, attempting to wage industrial warfare against an opponent with 17 times the economic capacity and 5 times the steel production. The M1 Garand had been in development since 1928, had entered service in 1936, had been refined through years of testing and modification, and was produced by a nation with enormous industrial slack capacity that could be mobilized when war came. Japan's attempt to copy this weapon began in 1944, when the war was already lost, when industrial capacity was strained beyond sustainable limits, when Allied bombing was disrupting production, when raw materials were scarce, when time had run out. The comparison was stark. United States Springfield Armory produced more M1 Garands during the first 4 months of 1944 than Japan produced total military rifles throughout all of 1945. American industry delivered 3,136 M1s per day at peak production, while Japanese industry struggled to assemble 125 Type 4s across 15 months. This wasn't a failure of Japanese engineering skill or worker dedication, it was mathematical inevitability. Industrial warfare, the kind that defined World War II's outcome, required production capacity, resource access, and economic depth that Japan simply didn't possess. The Type 4 rifle program's failure wasn't an aberration. It was representative of the broader industrial mismatch that made Japan's defeat inevitable once the United States fully mobilized its economy for war production. The M1 Garand's impact on Pacific War combat extended beyond simple firepower advantages. The rifle fundamentally altered infantry tactics, enabling aggressive maneuver that bolt-action rifles made difficult, allowing small units to suppress larger enemy forces, providing individual riflemen with sustained fire capacity that previous generations of soldiers had needed light machine guns to achieve. Japanese military doctrine, built around bolt-action rifles and bayonet assaults, couldn't adapt quickly enough to counter American firepower advantages. The tactical adjustments that might have mitigated M1 superiority, deeper defensive positions, greater dispersion, increased use of automatic weapons, required time and resources Japan didn't have. By war's end, the M1 Garand had become symbolic of American industrial and tactical superiority. General George S. Patton's assessment, the greatest battle implement ever devised, reflected not just the rifle's technical excellence, but its representation of American military industrial capacity, the ability to equip millions of soldiers with cutting-edge weapons while simultaneously producing tanks, aircraft, ships, and ammunition in quantities that overwhelmed Axis production. The Type 4 rifle, by contrast, represented Japan's recognition, far too late, that industrial firepower mattered more than fighting spirit, that production capacity determined outcomes more than tactical doctrine, that attempting to match American industrial output was futile when starting from such enormous economic disadvantage. One of the 20 surviving Type 4 rifles resides in climate-controlled display, mounted beside an M1 Garand for direct comparison. Museum visitors, mostly veterans or military history enthusiasts, study the Japanese copy with mixture of professional interest and historical irony, recognizing the desperation evident in every design decision, the modifications that reveal resource constraints, the quality variations that speak to impossible production timelines. The museum placard provides essential facts. Japanese Type 4 rifle, experimental semi-automatic copy of United States M1 Garand, approximately 125, produced at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, 1944-1945, never issued for combat deployment, represents Imperial Japanese Navy's attempt to counter American infantry firepower advantage during final year of Pacific War. What the placard cannot convey is the deeper historical lesson that Type 4 represents. Industrial warfare's unforgiving mathematics, the impossibility of matching opponent production when starting from catastrophic economic disadvantage, the futility of attempting to copy weapons when the underlying industrial infrastructure cannot support mass production. The M1 Garand versus Type 4 rifle comparison encapsulates the Pacific War's central dynamic: American industrial capacity against Japanese tactical skill, economic depth against fighting spirit, production volume against individual courage. In every category that mattered for industrial warfare, the United States held overwhelming advantage, and the Type 4 program's failure demonstrated how thoroughly those advantages determined outcomes. Japanese forces fought with remarkable determination throughout the Pacific War, defending positions until ammunition exhausted, conducting banzai attacks against overwhelming firepower, resisting even when defeat was mathematically certain. But courage and determination, critical as they were for individual battles, couldn't overcome the industrial and economic fundamentals that determined the war's outcome. The M1 Garand, produced by the millions, equipped forces across 2 theaters, remained in United States service through the Korean War and influenced subsequent rifle designs for decades. The Type 4, produced in quantities barely sufficient to arm a single company, never fired a shot in combat and exists now primarily as museum curiosity and historical footnote. This disparity, stark and absolute, represents industrial warfare's central truth. Production capacity matters more than tactical innovation when opponents are evenly matched in military skill. Economic depth determines outcomes when wars extend beyond initial campaigns, and attempting to match opponent industrial output is futile when starting from fundamental disadvantage. If one weapon could symbolize the Pacific War's outcome, the M1 Garand serves perfectly. Not because it was the most powerful weapon, aircraft carriers and B-29 bombers had greater strategic impact. Not because it was the most advanced technology, radar and proximity fuses were more revolutionary, but because it represented American industrial military capacity at its most fundamental level, the ability to equip every infantryman with weapons a generation ahead of opponent equivalents, produced in quantities that made obsolescence before wear out the primary concern. Japan's Type 4 rifle, conversely, represented the desperate impossibility of matching American production, the recognition, far too late, that industrial capacity would determine outcomes, and the futile attempt to copy weapons when the factories, raw materials, time, and resources necessary for mass production had already been consumed by a war economy pushed beyond sustainable limits. Between these 2 rifles, one produced by millions and one barely produced at all, lies the Pacific War's essential story: industrial democracy versus military empire, economic depth versus tactical skill, overwhelming production against desperate innovation. The outcome, written in production statistics long before the final battles, was never truly in doubt.